Ryan had never cared much about cooking. He could survive on takeout and frozen meals just fine, but when his best friend dared him to take a cooking class, just for fun, he figured, why not? It would be something different. Maybe he'd learn how to make something other than scrambled eggs. What he didn't expect was to walk into the class, tie an apron around his waist, and lock eyes with the woman who would change everything. She was standing at the counter, carefully chopping fresh basil. Dark waves of hair spilled over her shoulder, and she had this quiet, focused expression as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Then suddenly she glanced up at him, big brown eyes, warm and curious. "First time?" she asked, a teasing smile pulling at her lips. Ryan cleared his throat, feeling ridiculously out of place. "That obvious," she laughed, a soft, melodic sound that sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Let's just say you don't look like someone who spends a lot of time in the kitchen." She wasn't wrong. He had no idea what he was doing. But something about her made him want to stay, to prove he wasn't completely useless with a knife and a cutting board. "I'm Ryan," he said, offering his hand. She wiped hers on her apron before shaking his. "Mia." Their instructor, a middle-aged woman with a thick Italian accent, clapped her hands. "All right, everyone, tonight we make fresh pasta. Pair up and follow the steps carefully." Ryan turned back to Mia, raising an eyebrow. "Guess that makes us partners," she grinned. "Hope you're ready to get your hands dirty." What followed was the messiest, most frustrating, and somehow most fun experience Ryan had had in a long time. He fumbled through measuring flour, kneading dough, and rolling it into thin sheets. At one point he got flour all over himself, and Mia laughed so hard she nearly knocked over a bowl of eggs. "You're a disaster," she teased, brushing flour off his arm. He smirked. "Maybe I just needed a good teacher." She rolled her eyes but didn't pull away. Her fingertips lingered on his sleeve for just a second too long, sending a jolt of something unexpected through him. By the time they finished, their pasta was far from perfect, but it was edible. As they sat down to taste their work, Ryan found himself more interested in watching Mia than in eating. She was passionate about food, talking about different flavors and techniques with so much excitement that he couldn't look away. "Do you cook a lot?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah. My mom taught me when I was a kid. Cooking has always been my way of unwinding." He liked that about her. She wasn't just going through the motions, she cared about what she was doing. It was different from how he usually approached things, always going with the easiest option. "You gonna come back next week?" she asked, tilting her head. He should have said no. He had no real interest in learning how to cook, but looking at her, something inside him shifted. "Yeah," he said. "I think I will." And just like that, what was supposed to be a casual, one-time thing became something more. He didn't realize it yet, but he was already starting to fall. Ryan didn't know what he was doing here again. He could have easily skipped the second class. No one was forcing him to come back. And yet here he was, standing outside the small cooking school, hands shoved deep in his pockets, heart pounding in a way that made no sense. It had been a long time since he'd felt this kind of anticipation, the kind that made his pulse quicken, his skin prickle with something dangerously close to excitement. And it was all because of her. Mia. He stepped inside, scanning the room. His stomach dropped for half a second when he didn't see her right away, but then there. She was standing near the counter again, this time tying her apron, laughing at something the instructor said. She turned, and then those warm brown eyes landed on him. A slow smile spread across her lips. "You actually came back," Ryan smirked, walking toward her. "What, didn't think I could handle a second round?" "I had my doubts," she admitted, crossing her arms, "but I'm impressed." "Maybe there's hope for you after all." He chuckled, stepping beside her as the instructor clapped for attention. This time, they were making risotto. Something about patience, stirring and letting the flavors develop. Ryan wasn't sure about the mechanics, but he was sure about one thing: he liked standing next to Mia, liked the way she explained things to him with an easy confidence. like the way her shoulder brushed his when she reached for an ingredient. "You're stirring too fast," she murmured, watching him with a small smile. He raised an eyebrow. "Too fast." "I thought I was doing pretty well this time." She shook her head, stepping behind him, her hands gently guiding his. Slow, steady. "You have to let the rice absorb the broth little by little." Ryan swallowed hard. He could barely focus on the rice with her this close. He could feel the warmth of her body behind him, the light pressure of her hands on his. He wasn't sure if she noticed the way his breathing changed, but he definitely did. "Like this," she said softly, her voice near his ear. He forced himself to nod, to focus on the task instead of the way his skin burned where she touched him. The rest of the class passed in a blur of stolen glances, quiet laughter, and moments that felt heavier than they should have. When they finished, when they sat down to taste their dish, Ryan found himself watching Mia again. She was different. He didn't know how to explain it, but there was something about her that pulled him in. She caught him staring. "What?" He shook his head, smirking. "Nothing. Just trying to figure out if I actually like cooking or if I just like watching you boss me around." She laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe both." The class ended too soon. People started gathering their things, chatting about next week's lesson. Ryan should have just said goodbye, should have walked out like everyone else, but instead he hesitated. Mia noticed. "What's up?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "You want to grab a drink or coffee or—" He stopped himself, suddenly unsure. Her lips parted in surprise, and for a second he thought he'd misread everything. But then that smile returned, slow and teasing. "A drink sounds nice," she said. And just like that, something shifted. They walked to a small bar down the street, the air cool against his skin. Ryan wasn't nervous, he wasn't the type to get nervous, but there was something about this that felt different. Mia slid onto a bar stool, resting her chin in her hand. "So tell me. What do you actually do when you're not butchering pasta or over-stirring risotto?" He chuckled. "I work in advertising, nothing as exciting as cooking." She raised an eyebrow. "You don't like it," he hesitated. "It's fine, pays the bills." She tilted her head, studying him. "That's not exactly a glowing endorsement," he shrugged. "It's a job," she hummed, as if she understood something he wasn't saying. "What would you do if money wasn't an issue?" He blinked, caught off guard by the question. No one ever asked him things like that. "I don't know," he admitted. "Never really thought about it." She leaned forward, resting her elbow on the bar. "Come on, there's got to be something you love." Ryan hesitated, then exhaled. "I used to like photography, did it a lot in college." Mia's eyes lit up. "Really?" He nodded. "Yeah. But you know, life happens. Careers, responsibilities." She frowned slightly. "That's a shame." He smirked. "What about you? What's your dream?" She hesitated, then took a sip of her drink. "I want to open my own restaurant." Ryan sat up straighter. "Seriously?" She nodded. "Yeah, my mom had a little cafe when I was a kid. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was hers." "I want that." He watched her, the way her eyes softened when she talked about it. "You should do it," he said simply. She laughed. "Easier said than done. Doesn't mean it's impossible." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You're full of surprises, Ryan." He wasn't sure what that meant, but he liked the way she said it. The night stretched on, conversation flowing easily. By the time they stepped outside, the city lights casting a soft glow around them, Ryan knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just some cooking class anymore. This was something else entirely. And he wasn't sure he had any control over it. Ryan hadn't stopped thinking about Mia all week. It was ridiculous. They'd only met twice, once over a pile of flour, and once over drinks, and yet she was in his head like a song he couldn't shake. He found himself glancing at his phone, half expecting a message from her, even though they hadn't exchanged numbers. He even caught himself walking past the cooking school on his lunch break, subconsciously hoping to run into her. It was absurd, he barely knew her. And yet, the next class couldn't come fast enough. When he walked in, Mia was already there, tying her apron. She glanced up, and the way her lips curved into a knowing smile made his chest tighten. "You made it," she teased. He smirked, stepping toward her. "Starting to think I might actually like this." She arched an eyebrow. "The cooking or the company?" Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "You're full of questions, aren't you?" She grinned. "I like knowing things." Before he could respond, the instructor clapped her hands. "Tonight we make dessert." "Tiramisu." Mia's eyes lit up, and Ryan realized he loved that expression on her, the way her whole face brightened when she was excited. "This is one of my favorites," she said, rolling up her sleeves. Ryan leaned against the counter watching her. "That's a dangerous statement. Now you've set expectations." She laughed. "I can handle the pressure." They got to work, and Ryan quickly realized that making tiramisu was a far more delicate process than he expected. Whipping egg yolks, folding in mascarpone, carefully layering ladyfingers soaked in espresso, it was precise, almost methodical. Mia was in her element, moving with confidence, her hands steady as she showed him how to fold the mixture gently so it stayed light and airy. "You're concentrating so hard," she teased. "It's cute," Ryan huffed a laugh. "I don't want you judging me if this turns out terrible." She shook her head. "I wouldn't judge you. I'd just tell you exactly what you did wrong." He nudged her playfully with his elbow. "So merciless," she grinned. "Only with people I like." That gave him pause. Her words hung in the air between them, charged with something unspoken. He glanced at her, and for a second he thought she might say something more. But then she turned back to the dessert, her fingers brushing against his as they reached for the same bowl. Neither of them moved. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but it sent a spark through him. Mia inhaled sharply, then cleared her throat, pulling her hand away. "You should do the final layer of cocoa powder." Ryan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. "Yeah, sure." They finished plating their tiramisu just as the instructor called time. The class gathered around to taste each other's creations, but Ryan barely paid attention to anything except Mia's quiet laughter, the way her eyes found his across the table. By the end of the night, as they walked toward the exit, Ryan knew he couldn't just let her go with a simple goodbye. "Hey," he said as they stepped outside. "Come with me." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Where?" He shrugged. "It's a surprise." She hesitated for half a second, then smiled. "All right." They walked side by side through the city, the air crisp but not too cold. Ryan led her down a few side streets until they reached a small rooftop bar, one of his favorite hidden spots. Mia glanced around, impressed. "This is nice." Ryan smiled. "Figured you'd appreciate a place with good espresso martinis after making tiramisu." She laughed. "Thoughtful." They found a table near the edge, overlooking the city skyline. The lights stretched out before them, shimmering against the dark sky. Mia sighed contentedly. "I love views like this." Ryan watched her instead of the skyline. "Yeah," she nodded. "It makes everything feel possible, I guess." He tilted his head. "You say that like you don't always believe it." She hesitated, then exhaled. "It's just sometimes dreams feel so far away, like opening my own restaurant. I want it, but the reality of it." She trailed off, shaking her head. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You're the kind of person who makes things happen, Mia." "You'll get there." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You really believe that?" "Yeah," he said simply. Something shifted then. An invisible line blurred, an unspoken understanding settling between them. Mia looked down at her drink, then back at him. "You surprise me, Ryan," he smirked. "I get that a lot," she laughed, shaking her head. "No, I mean you're not what I expected when I first met you." He raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" She shrugged. "Someone who didn't take things seriously. Someone who wasn't this thoughtful." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm full of layers. I'm starting to see that." The night stretched on, conversation flowing effortlessly. And when they finally left, when they stood on the sidewalk, neither of them moved right away. Ryan wanted to kiss her. He could feel the pull, the way the air between them crackled with something unstated. but instead he reached for her hand, gently threading his fingers through hers. Mia looked up at him, surprised, but she didn't pull away, and that was enough. For now, Ryan couldn't remember the last time he had been this distracted. His focus at work had plummeted. Emails piled up, projects sat untouched, and every time someone called his name, he had to drag himself back to reality, because all he could think about was her. Mia. Every moment they'd spent together replayed in his mind the way she laughed when he messed up a recipe, the way she looked at him when she talked about her dreams, the way her hand had fit so perfectly in his when he held it outside the bar. It had been a simple touch, nothing dramatic, no grand declaration, but it had lingered in his mind like a song stuck on repeat. And now, as he walked into the next cooking class, his heart pounded like he was 17 again, waiting to see if the girl he liked would actually show up. She was already there, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her fingers tapping absently against the counter. When she saw him, her lips curved into a slow smile, and just like that, the world tilted back into place. "You're late," she teased. Ryan smirked, stepping beside her. Fashionably. She rolled her eyes, but there was warmth in them, a softness, something unspoken that made his chest tighten. Tonight's lesson was homemade pizza, and Ryan would have been excited about it if he wasn't so completely distracted by every little thing about Mia. The way she bit her lip when she concentrated. The way she nudged him playfully when he got flour on his shirt again. The way her laughter wrapped around him like the scent of warm bread in the oven. They worked side by side, kneading dough, spreading sauce, sprinkling cheese. At one point, Ryan reached for the same bowl of toppings that Mia did, and their fingers brushed. Neither of them moved. Mia inhaled sharply, her gaze flicking up to his. The air between them crackled, charged with something neither of them dared put into words. And then, someone bumped into Ryan from behind, jolting him forward just enough that his hand fully covered Mia's. Her breath hitched. Ryan swallowed hard, his pulse hammering. He should move. He should pull away, make a joke, pretend like it didn't send a jolt of electricity through his whole body. But he didn't, and neither did she. Instead, she turned her hand over beneath his, her palm pressing lightly against his own. It was barely a movement, barely a touch, and yet it felt like a decision. A small, quiet yes. Ryan exhaled slowly, letting his fingers curl around hers just for a moment before reality snapped back into place. Someone called out that the pizzas were going into the oven, and Mia pulled her hand away, clearing her throat. Ryan shoved his hands into his pockets, his skin still burning where she had touched him. Neither of them said anything about it, not yet. After class, they lingered outside the cooking school, neither of them in a hurry to leave. Mia hugged her arms around herself, glancing up at the sky. "It smells like rain." Ryan watched her, taking in the way her face softened in the glow of the streetlights. "Want to go somewhere?" She hesitated, then smiled. "Where?" He thought for a moment. "Come with me." She didn't ask questions, she just followed. They walked through the city, the air thick with the promise of a storm. Ryan led her to a small park tucked between buildings, where fairy lights hung from the trees, casting a golden glow over the benches and pathways. Mia looked around, her lips parting in surprise. "This is beautiful," Ryan shrugged. "Thought you might like it." She turned to him, something unreadable in her expression. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Surprising me," he smiled, stepping closer. "I like keeping you on your toes." She shook her head, but she was smiling too. "I don't know what to do with you, Ryan." He tilted his head, his heart pounding. "Then don't do anything, just be here right now." Mia exhaled, her gaze searching his. And then, just as she opened her mouth to say something, the sky cracked open. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking them instantly. Mia gasped, laughing as she pushed her wet hair out of her face. Ryan chuckled, blinking against the downpour. "Guess I should have checked the weather." Mia shook her head, still laughing. "You really are a disaster." And then, before he could stop himself, before he could second-guess it, Ryan reached for her, his hands framing her face as he kissed her. Mia froze for half a second, and then she melted against him, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as she kissed him back. The rain poured around them, cool and relentless, but all Ryan could feel was the warmth of her lips, the way she fit against him like she had always been meant to. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Mia rested her forehead against his. Ryan swallowed, his voice rough. "Tell me I'm not the only one feeling this." Mia closed her eyes, exhaling. "You're not." And just like that, everything changed. Ryan couldn't stop thinking about the way Mia had felt in his arms. The warmth of her body pressed against his. The way her fingers had curled into the fabric of his shirt, the taste of rain on her lips. It had been intoxicating, overwhelming, and completely unexpected. Now, standing outside the cooking school a week later, he felt like he was on the edge of something irreversible. Would she regret it? Would she pretend it hadn't happened? Or worse, would she act like it didn't mean as much to her as it had to him? He exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair before pushing the door open. The scent of garlic and fresh herbs filled the air, but all Ryan could focus on was her. Mia stood by the counter, arranging ingredients, her expression unreadable. When she looked up, their eyes met, and for a moment time stretched. Then she smiled, soft, genuine. And just like that, the knot in his chest loosened. "You showed up," she said, amusement flickering in her gaze. Ryan smirked, walking toward her. "What, were you expecting me to run scared?" She tilted her head, considering. "Maybe," he chuckled. "Guess I like proving you wrong." Mia shook her head, but there was a warmth in her expression that sent a pulse of something deep through him. The instructor clapped her hands, announcing that tonight's dish would be stuffed ravioli. Ryan barely heard a word, because all he could think about was Mia. The way her fingers moved as she rolled out the dough, the way she bit her lip when she concentrated, and the way, every so often, their eyes would meet and something unspoken would pass between them. At one point, as they were sealing the ravioli, Mia's hand brushed his. Ryan didn't move. Neither did she. Her fingers lingered, her breath hitching just slightly. It would be so easy to lean in, to kiss her again, but they weren't alone. Mia cleared her throat, pulling her hand back. "You're getting better at this." Ryan grinned, forcing himself to focus. "Maybe I had a good teacher." She rolled her eyes, but he caught the way her lips twitched. When the class ended, the usual hum of chatter filled the room as people packed up their things. Ryan hesitated, glancing at Mia. Would she leave first? Would she pretend like nothing had changed between them? But then she turned to him, something hesitant in her gaze. "Do you want to go somewhere?" she asked. Ryan's chest tightened. "Yeah." They walked side by side through the city, the air crisp and cool after the earlier rain. Neither of them spoke right away. It wasn't awkward, but there was something weighty between them, something unsaid. Finally, Mia broke the silence. "So, about the other night." Ryan glanced at her, his pulse kicking up. "Yeah," she exhaled, shoving her hands into her coat pockets. "I wasn't expecting it." Ryan nodded slowly. "Neither was I." She bit her lip, hesitating. "But I don't regret it." His chest warmed. "Good, because I don't either." She looked up at him then, her eyes searching his. "I don't know what this is," she admitted. Ryan stopped walking, turning toward her. "Me neither," he said honestly. "But I know I don't want to stop." Mia's breath hitched, her lips parting slightly. The city moved around them, cars passing, people laughing in the distance, but all Ryan could see was her. "I don't either," she whispered. A slow smile spread across his lips. "Then let's figure it out," he murmured, and when she nodded, stepping just a little closer, Ryan knew. He was already falling. Ryan had never been the kind of guy who believed in fate. He liked control, liked knowing where his life was headed. But with Mia, everything felt unpredictable in the best way possible, like he was standing at the edge of something bigger than himself. And for once, he didn't want to pull back. They had spent the last few weeks wrapped up in something neither of them had planned for. Nights filled with easy conversation, stolen kisses in the back of cabs, laughter over late-night takeout when they were both too tired to cook. It was terrifying how natural it felt, how quickly he had fallen into a rhythm with her. But tonight, something was different. Mia had been quiet all evening, her usual brightness dimmed by something she wasn't saying. Ryan had noticed the way she hesitated when he reached for her hand, the way her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes. Now, as they walked side by side through the city, the weight of unspoken words hung between them. Ryan finally stopped, gently catching her wrist. Mia. What's going on? She hesitated, looking down at where his fingers wrapped around hers. Then slowly she exhaled and met his gaze. I got an offer, she said softly, his heart clenched. An offer, she nodded, biting her lip. For a restaurant space, a good one, the kind of opportunity I've been waiting for. Ryan should have been happy for her. This was what she had dreamed of, what she had talked about since the moment they met, but the look in her eyes told him there was more. Where is it? He asked, his voice quieter now. She swallowed hard. Chicago. The word hit him like a blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Chicago. Mia wasn't just talking about a job, she was talking about leaving. Ryan let go of her wrist, running a hand through his hair. And you're going to take it. It wasn't a question. They both knew what this meant. Mia closed her eyes for a second before opening them again, her expression torn. I don't know. That surprised him. You don't know, he repeated, searching her face. She shook her head, frustration flickering across her features. Ryan, this is everything I've wanted. It's the kind of chance that doesn't come around twice. But then there's you. His throat tightened. Mia, I didn't expect you, she cut in, her voice cracking slightly. I didn't expect any of this. And now I don't know how to choose. Ryan's heart pounded. He had never been good at this, the raw, emotional conversations, the ones that left him open and vulnerable. But for Mia, he had already broken every rule he had ever set for himself. So he took a breath and forced himself to say the words that had been sitting in his chest for weeks. I love you. Mia's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. Ryan swallowed hard. I love you, Mia, and I know this is your dream, and I'd never ask you to give that up. But I need you to know that if you go, if you leave, I don't think I'll ever stop loving you. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then suddenly she stepped forward, grabbing his face in her hands as she kissed him, desperate, aching, filled with everything words couldn't say. Ryan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her in like he was afraid she might slip through his fingers if he let go. When she finally pulled back, her forehead rested against his. I love you too, she whispered. God, I love you, Ryan. His chest tightened. Then stay, Mia exhaled shakily. I can't. The words shattered something inside him. But then she cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. I can't stay, she repeated, but I don't want to leave you either. Ryan frowned, trying to understand. Mia took a deep breath. Come with me, the world tilted. What? Come with me, she said again, her voice steadier now. Chicago isn't just my dream, Ryan, it could be ours. You told me once that you used to love photography. What if this is your chance to start over too, to do something you actually love? Ryan stared at her, his heart pounding. He had spent so much of his life doing what was expected of him, following the safe path, never taking risks. But Mia, she made him believe in possibilities. And maybe that was what love was supposed to be, choosing each other, even when it was terrifying. A slow smile spread across his lips. You really think I'd survive in Chicago? Mia laughed, her eyes bright with hope. I think you'd survive anywhere as long as we're together. Ryan exhaled, letting the decision settle deep in his bones. Then he leaned in, kissing her softly. He didn't need any more time to think, because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he was meant to be, with her.